here's the thing, business schools love private equity associates in the classrooms.
Definitely more applicants skewing towards Harvard, Stanford, or bust. A little under 400 students at Harvard, Stanford, Wharton coming from private equity. There are obviously way more than 400 PE applicants.
In some ways, you are competing for the same spots, and you might be competing against folks in your firm.
You have to make HBS feel like it's the one and only. You really have to communicate that any way you can. Thousands of young professionals in private equity apply to business school every year, especially top programs like HBS, Stanford, and Wharton. With so much competition, the bar to scoring a spot is incredibly high. How can someone expect to pass it and gain acceptance? We're bringing in the expert to answer that question and more. Liza Weale, the founder of Gatehouse Admissions and a former MBA mission consultant herself. She's an MIT Sloan grad with more than 23 years in admission consulting and has helped thousands of applicants to get into top MBA programs, including, of course, many private equity applicants targeting Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton. She has loads of experience and expertise to share. Liza, really great to see you today. I know we have a lot of things in common, not the least of which we are both MIT Sloan graduates.
One thing, just a quick thing, I am wearing my brass rat. I just want you to appreciate that. I don't wear it too often. If you know, you know.
Went on to Bain & Company. I was a number of years ahead of you. And at that point, I left Bain & Company and sort of took this circuitous route to the world of private equity. And I know you deal with a lot of private equity clients. So I'm a PE applicant, and I really only want Harvard, Stanford, or Wharton. How should I even think about this? Am I a shoe-in, or am I like one of 10,000 PE applicants applying?
Definitely more the latter. There's certainly a lot of applicants from PE who will be applying. But here's the thing. Business schools love private equity associates in the classrooms. If you think about it, they're super well trained on diagnosing businesses, partnering with leadership teams, getting things done. So the schools really look at private equity applicants as vehicles for teaching the rest of the class. Bringing them along on all the topics that are being discussed in the classroom. So I always remind anybody coming from private equity, like, the schools love you. You're starting at that advantage. But there's that disadvantage that there are literally thousands of other candidates that kind of at first blush, if you're not careful, that are going to look just like you. And that's really the challenge.
That's right, because the reality of the situation is you as a PE professional are applying to business school, as is the person who could look just like you, not even, possibly even next to you, if not down the street at one of the, what we've all agreed, there's a lot of private equity firms now, which means a lot of analysts applying.
And I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is you're not necessarily competing with the person right beside you. They can take 2 people from your firm. They can't take 3 people. They can't take 12. They can't take 15. But it's not what we're talking about, the cultural reference point that I don't really understand. It's not the Hunger Games, even though I've never read the book or seen the movies. You know, it really is incumbent upon you simply to be your best, the tallest poppy, and to stand out a little bit. And I always talk about how standing out doesn't necessarily mean some sort of spectacular differentiation. It's very rare that you see someone who's in private equity who's done something else. It's so demanding. 2 years of banking, occasionally 2 years of consulting, 2 years of private equity, sometimes 3 years of private equity, like keeping up with your community activities, whatever. It's hard to be like starting a business on the side or, winning an Olympic gold medal. The applicants who do well in this process are often those where I was talking about like small turns of the dial, like an accumulation of small wins. Grades, you're probably not going to differentiate. It doesn't help to have sky high grades. But you add that to a little better GMAT score, and the GMAT averages or GRE averages are higher for this group already. So you're talking about higher than higher. And then you're talking about maybe like a recommendation that is contextualized and can prove you're a little bit better, you're a little bit more of the go-to. And then you're talking about community service where maybe some people have been, what I would say, some people are napping and some people after work find that way to push themselves or have a personal endeavor that they're pushing themselves towards. And all of a sudden, all of this accumulation, these small turns of the dial help to open the door. And that's the way, I think that's the way that I see private equity applicants succeed. Tiny accumulations rather than like some huge blow up win. Do you want to learn more about your target business schools? Check out On Track by mbaMission, where we have in-depth modules on all the top business schools, covering everything from what makes them unique to how to tackle the application essays and short answers, and so much more. You can also practice for interview and video questions, all done on your schedule, on demand. We appreciate your dedication to our podcast, and we want to offer you 30% off any On-Track subscription. Use the code MBAMPOD to get 30% off any On-Track subscription. Check it out at ontrack.mbamission.com.
Yeah, Liza, I was just going to say, I know Gatehouse has really some great relationships with some of the top private equity firms.
Yeah.
So clearly you have been in that situation where you have two people from the same firm, may at first blush look the same again, a lot of ways. So how do you even think about differentiating people?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is actually like what we always say is like focus. This is one time that it's time to focus inward and be all about you, be all about me. Don't worry about all the other noise that's going on around you, because you can start to psych yourself out and be like, oh, I don't have this, but I have that. But I've had 6 deals and this person's only closed 2, so I'm better, right? Forget about all the noise.
No one is counting deals.
Yeah, no one's counting deals.
No one cares.
Right, exactly. Or the size of the deal, like, this was, $2 billion versus $100 million.
Right.
What, and so I think the first tactic is always really digging in to what the source of your drive is, what inspires you. These kind of deeper questions that probably in private equity folks haven't thought about much.
Right. No, that makes sense.
And just to really start pulling on the thread. And, eventually people really can start thinking about those deeper motivations, and that's going to come out in their application, make for a stronger application is always our strategy. And I will say, you're right, that we do work with a number of private equity firms, and we're working with all of their associates as they apply. And several of them will find success. Not all of them, all of them at the same school, I should say. Several of them will find success at the same school. And so, Jeremy, to your point, yes, in some ways you are competing for the same spots. And you might be competing against folks in your firm, but it's not it's only one of you getting in. And if you have that attitude, it's probably going to, you're going to choose the wrong path and focus on the wrong stuff. Focus more on everybody else instead of focusing on you, which I think is essential.
Maybe we can actually take a step back and go to one of the first things you said, which is you sort of joked that what did you say about 10,000? You said 10,000 or
Are you shoo-in?
Maybe we can take a step back and just go back to one of your initial comments about like shoe-in versus 10,000 applicants.
Right.
Let's contextualize how many spaces there are at top schools. And let's definitely return to the types of schools that these PE applicants select.
Yes.
Because over the last 5 or 6 years, we work with a lot of PE applicants, so does Gatehouse. Definitely more applicants skewing towards Harvard, Stanford, or bust. And we're not hearing that from the HR departments, like it's got to be Harvard or Stanford. So let's come back to that. But let's contextualize, like Harvard has a little under 1,000 spots in its class. About 17% of the class is going to be from private equity. So, maybe 150 spots in a class. Stanford has about 450 students in a class. And again, I think about 17%. Someone else do the math for me as we go. Wharton has about 850, 875, 900 in a class. I think they're a little under, maybe around 15% in aggregate. We're sort of like a little under 400 students at Harvard, Stanford, Wharton coming from private equity. There are obviously way more than 400 PE applicants. So I think then you have to say to yourself, like, also, okay, that may even seem like a lot to some people. 400 spots, but then you say, okay, the schools kind of want to be equitable in terms of men and women. So, let's divide that by 2. There may be around 200 women and men. And then maybe they want about a third international. I don't know if they're going to get a third from PE, but they're still going to want some international. And they're going to want other ways that this overrepresented group reflects the class. And you start to look, and maybe that is what gives people some of that anxiety. So definitely not a shoe-in. Definitely not 10,000. But as you sort of parse and figure out your place in that mosaic, maybe your segment actually isn't that big among those 400 if you're looking at those schools.
I could see maybe 150 male or female, whatever it is, same number. Domestic applicants, 150. So we're looking really at maybe if in your demographic, 150 people is based on what sort of the numbers you just. So again,
and then even beyond that, you have to say to yourself, like, the schools want to have first generation college students.
Yeah.
They want to have, they can't explicitly have diversity in their class in the same way they used to.
Right.
But they're still trying to have diverse classes. So you start to really parse and the numbers, like you said, your demographic becomes smaller.
Yeah.
You would assume that would put some pressure on the applicants to look, I don't want to say it like it's so pejorative, like further down, like beyond Harvard and Stanford.
Right.
And we find that they're not necessarily like Chicago Booth is 8% private equity. That's not because they're limiting the number of PE people. It's because they're not getting a trickle down from those schools. And I think Liza and I were talking before this on off camera about how we both have. mbaMission and Gatehouse both have corporate clients that are private equity firms, and we're hearing from those who manage these programs, like it's not Harvard and Stanford or bust.
Yeah. I mean, I was actually just exchanging an email with a talent manager at a firm, and one of her associates had applied to Harvard and Stanford and was on the wait list at Harvard and was understandably, maybe not understandably, but was freaking out a little bit, like, I really want to get Harvard. And I went back and forth with the talent manager and said, this is just a good reminder for people to be thinking beyond Harvard and Stanford, or at least to have a frank conversation with oneself to say, am I really going to be okay if I don't go to business school, if I don't get in?
That's right.
And, I said, hopefully the candidate's thinking about Wharton. And she wrote back, she's like, falling on deaf ears or something like that. Like, I've been trying to say this for a long time. So I think the talent managers, they want to see their associates find success. And they know how each of these schools, how tremendous the MBA opportunity can be. So they're like, go ahead and think about other schools. And they're also recruiting or trying to recruit more broadly than just at Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton.
One of the funny things about that is I looked through the career reports, and it was something like 17% in at HBS, 17% out into private equity.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
In at Stanford, at Stanford, 17% out. And but then it was also like 8% in at Chicago, 8% out. So it's like basically what it was saying is PE people are finding jobs in PE. Like the friction is probably relatively low. It doesn't mean that to a man, every single one of those 8%. Some people say, I loved healthcare PE, but now I want to go to a healthcare firm. And so people do leave PE, but it to me, it suggested that there's this cohort of people is like Harvard, Stanford, that's it. Right. And those who are going into other M7 schools are still finding jobs. And a lot of them it's already set before they go. And I know a bunch we deal with a couple of family offices where I know they're like, we're going to hire you back, period. We want you back. Right. So, go to a great school, come back, and I know that of other top firms too, where people have returning offers before their schools are set. So it should kind of reflect that percentage in and percentage out as well. Yeah. But I mean, our job isn't to convince people to go. We're just trying to open their minds up a little bit to other programs.
I agree that it's not our job to convince applicants to go for one school or another, but I know you all do this too, is, to really encourage that there's a good chance you're not going to business school, because there are factors, if you are only applying to Harvard and Stanford, there is a big chance you're not going to business school. Right. There are factors that are outside of the applicant's control. I do think that, some firms, for whatever reason, the schools may or may not be interested in accepting applicants from those firms. It doesn't mean that that firm is not a great firm, but maybe the schools, they have a lot of stakeholders in this process. They have a lot of alumni at all these different firms. They have a lot of people that they've got to be maybe not keeping happy, but they have to be cognizant of. And so, there are things like perhaps your firm has a lot of representation at the school or has had representation for the past 2 years. Maybe the school's going to dial back on your firm and then choose more applicants from another firm. And that doesn't mean you're not a stellar candidate. Right. And put all that noise behind you and out of your mind anyway, because it's not going to change the outcome, and you're still going to have to have a shot, you're still going to have to do the same amount of work and the same amount of reflection.
Right. And listen, one thing I think that we're all sort of lumping together is this notion here of private equity firms. You're coming from a private equity firm. When we talk about that, I think about it on two dimensions. First of all, there's certainly the big guns. Everybody knows the brand names. Yeah. Are they greatly advantaged in this process? Or to flip it around, there's a world of, let's say across the country, there's 1,000 private equity firms of all different shapes and sizes. Are those two candidates, two separate candidates, big firm, small boutique firm, are they looked at differently? Are they looked at the same? Is there one bucket for private equity candidates, or is there many different buckets in the sense of they want someone coming from the super big firms and someone coming from, a 4-man family office? How do the admissions committee think about, quote, private equity and the candidates and what they may look like?
If you look at, the prestige private equity firms, it's not that because you're at that firm, you get in or have a better shot. It's more that like you have consistently been a cut above to get there. Right. So I think one of the things you have to keep in mind is that individuals who are at elite prestige private equity firms generally have a very strong track record of success. Success not only professionally, but like the overall track record academically, even extracurricularly, that allow them to stand out to get the job at the bank or the elite consulting firm, and then have continued to perform to the point where they can get the job at the elite private equity firm. And so it's like you've got these indicators at top firms that like, hey, I'm a cut above, and that's what the schools are looking for. They want the individuals who are cut above. Doesn't mean you can't have that at a very small family office. We have a relationship, again, with a couple of small family offices. The applicants do exceptionally well. That's also just a different form of revealing that you're at an elite firm.
That's right.
I think that also, it's like anything. I mean, Harvard doesn't accept only 900 Harvard applicants every year. They'll accept several people from schools that no one's ever heard of. And so there are going to be firms that the admissions committee maybe hasn't heard of. But if you've had a very, very active role at a smaller firm that someone hasn't heard of before, if you have done something unusual. I had an applicant a couple of years ago, like a moderately well-known firm, but he was seconded and was on the factory floor helping.
That's right.
Like helping with their production issues for a lengthy period of time. I think it was close to a year, if I recall. He just had a great story to tell. It didn't matter what firm he was at.
That's right.
That's lucky. Like not everyone, you can't request that opportunity. You can't get that. So it's like a combination of like prestige helps. But you still, kind of, am I dating myself here? Like, show me the money. You gotta go out there and say, look, I've still had like a real thoughtful experience at this firm.
Now, I frequently talk to my clients about this notion of behind the desk work and in front of the desk work. And what I really mean by that, behind the desk work is sort of what an analyst does, right? They spend a lot of time looking at spreadsheets, looking at legal documents. And then there's a few of them who are on the other side of the desk, on the factory floor, actually getting involved, maybe even really being, as you said, seconded in a company that's going through a takeover. That's sort of an amazing type of experience that, again, many private equity applicants simply don't have. And that, I think, is possibly, we never know for sure, another point of differentiation.
Although one thing you said is, yes, maybe part of this has to do with luck, but going back to your first question, your very first question about what can private equity applicants do to strengthen their candidacy and to, have a better shot, they can be proactive of trying to get those experiences.
Yes, absolutely.
I think, all too often we work with folks who are coming in last minute, say in the summer, before they're going to hit submit in the fall, and there's very little time that you can find these opportunities, although you still can. But, what we encourage our clients to do, and just encourage anybody, really even outside of private equity, but even in private equity, to find those opportunities to work more closely with a portfolio company, to find something internally at the firm and really step up and own it.
That's right.
Yes, it helps. Sometimes the firm might not do secondments. All right, but are there other ways that you can take a more active role?
That's right.
Do a little bit of a stand-in CFO role with a portfolio company or something like that.
One of my favorite examples is a young woman I worked with a few years ago who's already graduated from Harvard, and she just knew to put her hand up or to listen thoughtfully. And one of her MDs volunteered with a charitable foundation in that city, like a civic foundation, and they needed a new strategic plan. And he just happened to mention it. She was like, I'd like to do that. And so she just had this like other big, like impactful extra. And it was just a matter of listening. It wasn't, I don't think it took her it wasn't a second job for 2 years. I think she spent, it was a sacrifice. She spent her limited free time working and doing this extremely well. But she had this whole other dimension, and actually, if I recall, got a letter of recommendation from the executive director of this foundation.
Right.
And it was like this huge exclamation point, and it didn't come even from asking; it came just from listening, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of young people in their careers aren't probably, it's hard to ask someone who's senior to you, who's busy, like, hey, can we talk about how to manage my career here? It's a tough conversation to have, and maybe you have to have the right supervisor to allow it, and maybe it doesn't work for everyone. But for those who don't have that person where you can have that conversation, say, I'd like to push myself in new areas. What do you need? What can I do to be the highest performing individual that I can possibly be here? What would you like to see from me?
Right.
You could at least listen and find those opportunities.
Right. And listen, let's carry that forward. When you apply to business school, you're going to need recommendations. And you can imagine what a recommendation looks like from someone who you've actually really stepped up for and you've done things that were not expected of you. You can imagine what that recommendation would look like versus maybe somebody else who did a great job, who did a fantastic job, but never took that extra step. And I think one thing that we have always found is maybe recommendations are somewhat under-indexed, I think, for many applicants. This idea here of there's another piece of real estate out there, something else that can say just how wonderful you are. And I feel like they're not general. I mean, in certain instances it's the case, but frequently I always feel like there's a little bit more room with regard to recommendation in terms of getting them to a different place than maybe most people expect.
And one thing PE applicants have to think about is that they're in an industry where it's very, very likely that their recommenders have written recommendations before.
That's absolutely true.
This is not new to them. They generally speaking know what they're doing. They generally speaking are open to a little bit of input. It doesn't mean you have to ghostwrite it. That's not a good idea for you. But certainly prepping them and reminding them of the things that you've done under their watch. We're all of our attention spans are short, and I may not remember the amazing thing that someone on our team did 6 months ago. Nothing wrong with saying, "Hey, remember." Remember, it's been a year, but remember, I did that strategic plan. Like that's a showpiece for me. I just want to make sure that you're on that.
Absolutely,
it's important.
No question about it.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about like what I always call the tallest poppy, the individual who stands out. But what about those who have blemishes? Like, is it over because it's so I was saying, that turns the dial? What if you don't have? What if one of those turns the dial is a backwards turn? You have a lower, wonderful grades, great performance. Lower test score, what's lower than average for, let's say that you were using the old GMAT, the school's average is like 740, the average for PE might be 760. What if you have a 700 and you're a male applicant? Is it game over at that point?
Or I'm going to take it one step further. Let's say you have all of those things and you're working at a no name, and I hate to use those terms, a no name private equity firm. What do you do then? And the reality is I've worked with this a number of times, and business schools also recognize that people mature, that in many ways some people blossom late, and you may only be, quote, your best self at the age of 25 at that private equity firm, but it manifests in a very real way. You're the person who then has really mature conversations with the CEO of some of your portfolio companies, or you're the person who actually, identifies an industry the private equity firm has never looked at before, and suddenly they start talking deals in that industry. I've had that as exact experience, sort of a very small private equity firm. This person identified a very small niche piece of a big market. He got really deep into that market. He started knowing all the players in there, and suddenly he's bringing real deals. And at the end of the day, can you imagine the initiative it takes to do that at a private equity firm? Business schools recognize that. Recommenders recognize it when they actually go right to recommendation. And suddenly this person did very well in the admissions process.
Right. So interestingly, sort of no-namey firm. I remember an individual that I worked with a few years ago, now graduated, went to the GSB, and it was just that there was an interesting niche. He was at a very small firm it got really into, I think it was like insurance or the warranty space or something. Like he sort of had this very, very particular niche, and just again sort of hit it hard. Like it wasn't that he was bringing deals like that, but it was just like this experience was a little different. I got really. I guess he got really operational in a way that I think a lot of people were like his contemporaries were advisory. They were in an office at arm's length putting together decks, and he was able to be like, look, I really am on top of this, and I've learned and accumulated knowledge and have like expertise, and that helped to reveal that maturity. Ultimately, he was on the wait list for 4 of 5 schools and got into the GSB. That was the only school he got into.
Yeah, Liza, if I understand correctly, you've had really good experience with actually working with 2 people who, quote, look very similar, are at the same firm, yet they both got in. How do you help people distinguish themselves in that particular case?
Yeah, and just to clarify, we work with multiple, at a few firms, we work with their entire class. Okay. So much more than just 2 people. It's, the entire class is applying, which actually on our end, it's interesting because we start to see, we learn more about the firm. We know all the recommenders. We start to understand the ethos of the different firms, which makes it a lot of fun on our end. But I would say, again, it goes back to really diving into each person's ambitions, their goals, and then figuring out where did they really over-index? What's their sweet spot? What are the crucible moments that have really defined someone? Yeah. And it's all about figuring out, their voice, their story, making sure that they tell it. There's lots of appetite to accept several people from the same firm. We see it happen all the time. Yeah. And some of the differentiation will come out in the letters of recommendation too, where, the strongest letters of recommendation are really where somebody jumps off the paper. You can really see, you're right in the office with that person, seeing that person. There's no bluster.
It's all really fact-based and like undeniable, right?
Yes, exactly.
The examples are so rich and thoughtful that this can't be made up. It's not ChatGPT. It's not, this is the greatest associate we've ever had. You've got to accept them. It's like, here are a bunch of facts that prove that this person is better than others.
Which we should talk about ChatGPT at some point because that is definitely getting in there. But to your point, and I think that is what it very much will make it harder for a school to reject. They'll be able to see the difference between these different applicants and find a spot. If they're superstars, there's going to be a spot in the program for them, even if they're coming from the same firm.
Let me just pick up on one thing, which is this idea here is an applicant, whether they're from private equity or somewhere else, they have to tell this really authentic, rich story.
Yes.
And the reality is, where does that come from? It comes from them doing a lot of introspection work, a lot of brainstorming. So if an applicant says to you, what should I really be focusing on? Well, part of it is sort of what you should be focusing on as a person. Understand who you are, really get yourself thinking about, okay, what does my future look like? What do I like? What don't I like? And at the end of the day, that is going to not only be beneficial for you as a person, it's also going to really help as you write that unique recommendation. And we've talked about it in the past, is I don't want to hear about sort of overrepresented demographics. I don't want to hear about there's 1,000 private equity applicants, because the reality is there's only one you. I know it's a cliche, but there's only one you.
And yet I would just say this, but you have to cultivate that you, right? And so if there's anyone listening to this today, what's the best time to plant an olive tree is 100 years ago, right? Like, it's a hyper competitive pool. You can't start working 2 months before you apply. And again, we keep saying, we go to firms. I give presentations on long-term private equity, like on long-term planning for private equity associates, that people kind of understand what they need to do. I do get people who call me a year later, like, I love the presentation. I wish I had done all that stuff, right? And so, and so you have to. This is a competitive group. It doesn't mean you have to live every day to get into business school, but we're talking about lots of those incremental benefits. Right. Yes, take the GMAT or GRE early so you have time to do your best on it. That's an easy one. Right. Get involved in your community. Be listening or putting your hand up at work. Get involved in your work community and on an extracurricular basis if your firm has a charitable board or there's associate training you can run or whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
Your own personal endeavors. Like, these are the things we talk about in terms of long-term planning. Right. There are things that are more critical when you're in a hyper competitive group.
That's right.
One other thing I think is really important also, we have a lot of data from the private equity applicants we've worked with. Male applicants tend to do better to matriculate at the end of their 3rd year of it might be 2 years of banking or consulting, 2 years of PE, maybe a 3rd year of PE. Again, that's sort of like, I'm a cut above. Not everyone made that.
Right.
I always say it's almost like the sophomore in basketball playing against himself as a junior. I've got a year more of coaching. I mean, you're stronger. I mean, maybe a little taller.
Right. And also just a more mature person in the class.
Yeah, more mature. And so male applicants tend to do better. Female applicants, I think, it can be okay if they've got 1 year and they're applying, but male applicants tend to do better. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they're at a small startup or they're in corp dev somewhere. But they tend to do better in their applying after their second year to get in after their third year. I'm sure you found that as well.
We certainly have, and it's something I'm very open with when people are thinking about, should I apply this year or should I hold off? And there is that truth that you probably, if you just are in your first year of private equity, you're probably going to be stronger. That doesn't mean you're not going to find success. There's always that gray area. Does not mean that you won't find success this year, but you are going to be stronger next year. And it's a little bit up to you on when to apply. I want to go back to something you were asking about, Harold, of just this thought process and the introspection that people do. And I think sometimes there's this tendency to think that you have to have the biggest, best stories. And you were talking a little bit about that, Jeremy. And I think sometimes people really struggle with, they feel like they have to have the boldest stories, right? They need to be the best private equity associate, and they need this amazing, job on a deal that went to committee. And we were working with this client who was at a middle market private equity firm, and he was a super solid applicant. And the first cuts of his essays it was back in the former HBS essay where it was one journey. And it was making a mountain out of 6 different molehills. And it was so over the top. And it was taking this really small thing and being very overwrought about it. And, because I think where he was struggling was having confidence in his story. And he had this beautiful journey that started with the way his grandfather had inspired him, came over from Greece, and just how he really used integrity and listening and being humble as a way to shape his career. But that story isn't loud. That story isn't bold, but it actually, when it was told, when he really reflected into his inside, that was the story that gave me goosebumps when I read.
This might be a good opportunity for Liza and I to shill for our own free book, which is we wrote a book on successful Harvard Business School and Stanford Business School essays, and there are a couple of examples that I know of clients of mine who are in that book, including one about puzzling. I know the names of that book are disguised. I can't remember his disguised name, but if you go to the book as a PDF and search for puzzling, This is an individual just had a passion for puzzles. He was at a PE firm, and he talked about this kind of motif around solving puzzles. It was true to him. It was very true. He had solved a variety of puzzles, and he talked about the complexity of a structure of a deal that he kind of he figured out how to tweak and change so that his firm could actually win that mandate. His recommender talked about at the end. It wasn't mind blowing, but he also he was critical. He was impactful in that moment. But he also talked about the role of puzzles throughout his life. And I mean, he got puzzles as gifts. People were leaving puzzles on his desk sometimes. It wasn't. It's not that if the next client is I'll start talking about puzzles. It doesn't work that way. That's this person's lived experience. But it made for a very thoughtful essay for this individual, and it wasn't that he had started the Twitter replacement and had climbed Mount Everest. He just was thoughtful and really understood who he was. And so when the admissions committee read his application and he got into Harvard, they just were this is a real person. This is an interesting person. This is a person who's figuring things out throughout his life. Among this cohort, seems like an interesting guy to have in the class.
One thing I do want to highlight here is, again, this is a very human process, and we've had admission committee members say to us, specifically, I want to like the person, right? I just want to like the person. It doesn't matter if it's a private equity, consultant, investment bank, or whatever it is. With any applicant, sometimes it's just really hard to communicate likability. And I want every applicant to really think about that, in particular private equity applicants who, in fact, there's not a huge premium on likability.
I think that's right. I mean, I think you've got a lot of people who've just been very motivated. Their head's been down. They're working extremely hard. And they're successful in a not just cutthroat, but in an environment where they have to be serious and professional all times. It's sometimes they take a step back and Okay, like I haven't a lot of time to think about who I am, what I'm doing, what I'm about.
Right.
If you want to be one of our success stories, sign up for a free consultation with a member of our full-time MBA admissions team. Since we've worked with tens of thousands of applicants over the past 2 decades, we can give you our honest opinion on your chances and help you put together your very best application. That is not a sales call, but rather your first session with one of us for free. We can give you a profile evaluation, answer specific questions about the process, review your resume, talk about your school choices, and so much more. Sign up at mbaMission.com/consult. We look forward to working with you. This actually leads to something that I think we should talk about, which is goals, because I think a lot of PE applicants find it hard to contextualize interesting goals because they're like, well, I'm in private equity. I want to go back to private equity.
Right.
How do you ensure that goals pop if someone's like in private equity and wants to go back?
Yeah.
The first question I always ask them is to start thinking about the impact you want to have, the legacy you want to have. And then I say, okay, legacy is a big word. Let's not, freak somebody out, but focus on the problems you want to solve, the kinds of companies you want to work on.
Right.
Focus on the impact of the results, not the what are you doing. Because I think there is this tendency to think, I want to go back. And it's fine if they want to go back. It's great.
Right.
There's a lot of hungry mouths.
Many do.
Maybe we can stop there and say that I think there's some sort of like guilt complex in wanting to go back. Like, it sounds like the only goal I have is wanting to make money if I go back to private equity. There are people who find the work interesting. They find the work they find the work challenging.
Yeah.
They are helping to build companies, helping to solve operational problems. Like there are all sorts of ways. You have to know what it is about that you enjoy.
And I also say, I think there's also this misconception that I'll have a better shot if I say I'm going to business school to change my career.
Right.
So they sometimes it's like, well, I think I should say this. Is that what you really want to do? Lo and behold, it's not. They do just want to go back and invest. And one thing I always say is that, the private equity firms, those are a lot of hungry mouths to feed on the other side of this process.
Right.
There will be a lot of recruiters, and the schools are happy to keep those stakeholders happy. So they're not going to discount your application because you want to return to private equity. But you do have to think about what is again, where's that source of drive?
Right.
What is the output of it, and what's that going to really, how's that solving a problem? Or what is it that inspires you about private equity? Right to that instead of I want to become a partner at this firm and continue to do investing. Focus on the underlying, what it is you're hoping to achieve.
Right. And this notion, too, of specificity is credibility. So when someone says to me, I want to go into private equity, from whether they're coming from private equity or somebody who does not have that background, I say to them, private equity is really big. It's really big and can mean all sorts of different things to all sorts of different people. So you want to go back to private equity. Why? Is there an industry that really gets you excited? Is there a size company that you see there's an opportunity? Help me understand what you mean by private equity. Because at that point, maybe we are able to find that passion that really will be a great foundation for an essay.
And also, you have to be careful when you're messaging about why you want to go to business school, because if you're just saying I want the network, and you're kind of coming across as saying, my firms make me do this, or I kind of need this little stamp on my resume, and you've got to be able to say look. Stanford says, why Stanford? Wharton says, why Wharton? Yeah. Harvard doesn't actually ask you why Harvard, but you've got to be able to say, look, there is an academic need. There's stuff I need to learn to be successful in my career going forward. And you have to be aware of that. And it can't just be Wharton has 2 finance classes I want to take. If you're saying you want to start in your own private equity firm at some point, maybe you need to understand how, you need to go deep on organizational behavior to understand how to create a certain culture at your firm, or maybe you need to take operational courses, whatever it might be. Maybe you need to take finance classes. That's fine. Right. You need to have a perspective on that and some thought on that.
Right. And create a curriculum for yourself. At the end of the day, go look at what business schools teach you, what they teach private equity professionals, and then see if that's what you want. Because if it is, that's also something to communicate.
Quick points. Schools recognize, one thing I always say is they recognize things might change when you go to school. Right. But you need to show that you have a plan to fall back on in case things don't change. They sometimes say, I want to go start a business, I don't know what, but I want to go, you need some more specificity than that. And you need to give the schools confidence that you at least have some Marching marching orders that you're ready to follow and chase when they're, as opposed to, just wandering around. So it's always fascinating to see when clients, former clients graduate, to see what they end up doing. Right. And some will invariably change directions completely. Maybe they played something that they felt pretty confident about when they submitted their application, but once there, they decided to take that leap and start that company. But I also love when people are right and they're doing exactly what they said they were going to do. Yes. I was just exchanging emails with a client of ours from about 2 or 3 years ago, very interested in healthcare. He was in private equity in Boston and focused on healthcare. And he was originally from the Midwest, and his goal was to really help bring better healthcare to the Midwest. So he wanted to go back into private equity, but focus on healthcare and bring it to more rural areas in the middle of America. And I was just emailing him, and he said he got a job focused on healthcare. And I just was like, you go. Like, that's great when you do have that vision and you leverage business school to actually get there. It was just really inspiring to see that.
One thing we haven't talked about is, the schools, Harvard and Stanford in particular, are competitive with each other. And you kind of have to play your cards close to your chest if you're applying to both, because if you
we see that.
Yeah,
we absolutely
if you indicate too strongly that you're going to go to one, the other one probably will reject you. And like, the schools are known to reach out to staffers and kind of like try to get a sense of where is this person leading before they accept that person. And I think there's a little bit of a burden on someone who is, based in New York, let's say, or based in San Francisco. There's a bit of a burden on that person to really say, like, I'm going to make this move. Like, I'm not wed to Palo Alto. Right. And if you're at a Silver Lake or something like that in Palo Alto, then you might have to do some subtle like persuasion and convincing that you're gonna like move across the country, and you really, really want to be at Harvard. It's not they're going to reject you. There are going to be some people who can make the move across the country, but your entire thing can't say my identity.
I think that's
is based in the West Coast. Right. I want to jump to Harvard for 2 years, and then I'm going to go. They're not going to believe it.
I'm living that right now. To be honest with you, I'm living that right now, where I have a client of mine who is going to be interviewed at HBS. He really wants to go to Stanford, and I think he has a really good shot at Stanford. You never know, of course. So I've said to him repeatedly, you have to make HBS feel like it's the one and only. You really have to communicate that any way you can. And sometimes it's specificity around what you're actually going to do there. Sometimes it's even just talking about, here's how I see my future laying out, and has more of a Harvard feel than a Stanford feel. And I think that is something real.
And sometimes it's even something as simple as like, I want to go to Wharton. I visited my cousin on campus so many times. I've walked around the campus. I visited myself. Whatever it might be, just to say, like, look, this isn't something so foreign to me. Like, I'm in San Francisco. It's plausible that I would move to Philadelphia. I think Wharton is actually very, very sensitive about that. And I've often said to some PE applicants, the only way you don't get into one of 3 schools is if, luck of the draw, you just, you don't get into Harvard or Stanford, and Wharton thinks that you're only going to go to the others.
Totally.
Again, I have that experience. I've certainly had ding reviews where I've talked to people, looked at this exact situation. I mean, exactly. They thought they were good enough to get into Harvard and Stanford. They sort of dismissed Wharton. They sort of did it as an afterthought. Wharton could not reject them faster. That was really the bottom.
I haven't visited. I don't know the resources very well. When Wharton says to me, who have you talked to in our community? I don't have any answers for them.
And the great irony is Wharton asks, why Wharton? It just goes out there and it asks, why Wharton? And then not to really take that question seriously.
And then you say, what are you going to contribute to Wharton? So basically their 2 essays are all about them. And if you can't prove it to them,
Harold, I have something to add. Just what you were saying about your client who you were saying, go in and show HBS that it's about them. I was working with a client a few years ago who was waitlisted at both Stanford and Harvard. And she was convinced that Harvard was going to be the one, if either of them accepted her, it was going to be Harvard. She was from the East Coast. She had some heavy hitters, which we have a chance we should talk about that. She had some heavy hitters put in a note of support on her behalf. And in her mind, she almost took the foot off the gas when it came to GSB. And she, you know the wait list process. There's a lot of updates. You need to show them that you're serious about them. But in her mind, she was flabbergasted because she got accepted off the wait list, which is no small coup from GSB. And she almost assumed because she was accepted at GSB, she'd get off the wait list from HBS. The next day, she was actually dinged from HBS. And it was kind of this moment of, wow, not only never, count your chickens before they're hatched, but also really like, we don't really know what the schools are looking for when it gets to that level. They want a little bit of everything in those classrooms.
Yeah, and like from what we know of the schools, they don't really know what they're looking for. Sometimes it's like we love all the we've got 25 candidates. We can only accept 8 at this point.
Right.
It's just someone's not going to make it, and it happens. I mean, I had a West Coast private equity applicant from a large firm, reapply. He got in. He was the last person on the wait list, and he reapplied.
It's my understanding that somewhere between 15 and 20% of all Harvard Business School students applied at least twice, if not more.
That might include the 2+2s, I think.
That's true.
Sure
That's
does,
true.
Yeah.
But it also includes Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, most successful company in the world. Can we all agree to that? Or one of them?
Certainly one of them,
Yeah. Rejected 10 times from Harvard Business School. So the reality is, listen, this is tough. To get back to some of the key things we said is you have to tell a great story. It requires a lot of introspection. It really requires you to really be attuned to what you want to do. And the reality is that entire process, introspection, defining your goals, thinking about how one school may serve your needs versus another is hard to do. And that's why we get to MBA Mission and some of the things that we do. And again, not too much of a commercial, but the reality is if you are in such a incredible applicant pool, such a competitive applicant pool, and if your entire life you've always pushed for that one extra piece, again, without really sounding like turning this into a commercial, the reality is that you may need some help telling that great story, that's really going to be required.
For sure. And we could give the commercial to Liza as well and say that we think that, we know the outcomes. And so, Gatehouse has had a tremendous record of success with private equity applicants.
That's right.
And is trusted by several top private equity firms. And, we just, it's a hyper-competitive process where every increment of difference makes, will make the overall difference. People would be wise to at least take advantage of the free half hour with either of our firms.
I mean, I have to say, gentlemen, it's great talking shop with you. We could do this. We could do this for 16 more hours. We have so many stories to share of our past clients and what we've seen, the pitfalls and how they've actually, carried the day and got the acceptances that they want. So thank you so much for letting me come in and join today's talk. It was great. And definitely reach out to us because obviously everyone at this table cares a lot about those applicants to business school.
Thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for Liza being here today.
If you want to be one of our success stories, sign up for a free consultation with a member of our full-time MBA admissions team. Since we've worked with tens of thousands of applicants over the past 2 decades, we can give you our honest opinion on your chances and help you put together your very best application. That is not a sales call, but rather your first session with one of us for free. We can give you a profile evaluation, answer specific questions about the process, review your resume, talk about your school choices, and so much more. Sign up at mbaMission.com/consult. We look forward to working with you.